Post-war London, thousands of fans are jostling to get a glimpse of their idol, an overnight sensation back on British soil after a spell in Hamburg. Police line the arcing pavement of Finsbury Circus, standing shoulder to shoulder outside the imposing Victorian edifice of the Danish Club. Inside, their hero is taking to the stage. The crowds have been glued to their radios for weeks, desperate to hear his voice crackle through. Suddenly, a throng pierces through the police line, shoving the bobbies aside to get a few precious steps closer to the man of the hour. But this isn't a pop star we're talking about. It's the captain of a cargo ship, a short, stocky Dane named Henrik Kurt Carlson. About a decade before Beatlemania was born, Carlson Mania was here, and it was sweeping the globe. Carlson had been the captain of a humble freighter named Flying Enterprise, a World War II cargo ship which had been doomed for obscurity had disaster not struck. In 1952, the ship was caught in a shocking storm and began to sink. For days, Carlson and his crew fought hard to save their ship as newsreel cameras captured the entire thing on film, and the world held its breath. Stuck hard over onto her side, smashed by enormous white waves, all the odds were against Flying Enterprise, and her captain had his work cut out for him. With cargo shifting in her holds, the ship was at risk of flipping over entirely. Could she be saved? Or would the vessel roll and take her valiant crew down with her? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the true story of the SS Flying Enterprise and her unlikely celebrity captain, Kurt Carlson. Flying Enterprise had humble beginnings. It was one of thousands of ships built for wartime use by the United States Maritime Commission, the same government agency that was responsible for the Liberty and Victory ships. The commission led the biggest merchant shipbuilding effort in world history, one that made an indispensable contribution to the Allied war effort. But launching so many vessels in such a short amount of time meant sacrificing quality for quantity. Liberty ships, in particular, became infamous for suffering hull and deck cracks, in some instances snapping in half without warning. Flying Enterprise, or Cape Kumikaki as she was first christened, was a Type C1 cargo ship, and these differed from the Liberty and Victory classes in important ways. They were the smallest of the three, and they were designed for short routes, where high speed and capacity were less important. The first C-Series vessels were designed before hostilities broke out, and they were built beyond the exigencies of war. They were meant to be commercially viable ships that would help reduce US reliance on foreign shipping. Liberty ships were based on C1 plans, but they were altered to make them even cheaper and quicker to build, and, at the same time, bigger by every measure. Plates that had been riveted together were welded instead, letting the cracks spread unimpeded throughout the hull. As Flying Enterprise's story would eventually show, though, that didn't mean cracks were out of the question. In 1946, Washington passed the Merchant Ship Sales Act, allowing the sale of surplus war-built merchant vessels to domestic and foreign buyers. The next year, Cape Kumikaki was sold to the New York-based Isbranston Line, the leading American-flagged shipping company servicing the eastern seaboard and the Mediterranean. Renamed Flying Enterprise, she began her new life as a general cargo freighter, transiting the North Atlantic. Flying Enterprise's fateful final voyage began on December 21st, 1951, at the port of Hamburg. On the banks of the River Elbe, stevedores winched a dizzying array of cargo into her 5 holds. This included pig iron, Volkswagen cars, antique French furniture, priceless musical instruments, Swiss watches, carpets, gherkins in brine, a collection of Japanese ivory figures, scholarship applications from German students, maybe even weapons of mass destruction, if the conspiracy theorists are to be believed, but more on that later. Heavy fog crept in as the Flying Enterprise rode the evening tide out of Hamburg. Spiked mines from the Second World War still bobbed in Europe's sea lanes, while remaining ordnances were marked with warning buoys. Plotting a safe course through pea soup meant that for 30 hours, Carlson never took his eyes off the smoky water. The fog held all the way into the English Channel, swept away at last, after a string of sleepless nights on the bridge, by something far more dangerous. 4 days out of Hamburg, on Christmas Day, the Enterprise flew right into the maw of a terrible storm, the worst the Atlantic had seen in half a century. Passengers and crew tried to celebrate with a turkey dinner, but as the festive lights swayed above, the captain's table was empty because Carlson was back on the bridge. Hurricane-force winds whipped the seas southwest of Ireland into a frenzy. On Boxing Day, one tremendous wave smashed into the ship's port side, what in later retellings would be dubbed a rogue wave. Down below, the engineers were thrown across the ship. Carlson, mid-shave, lurched to the side. Passengers bounced out of their bunks. Although they didn't realise it at the time, this single wave dealt a fatal blow to the Enterprise, critically wounding the vessel at its weakest spot. As night turned into day, waves continued to froth and spit at the injured ship. The sky and the sea merged into a seamless, roiling grey, distinguishable only by the foaming whitecaps that surged through the mist. The din of the breakers and the howling of the wind were deafening, but, for just a second, all these sounds were drowned out by an even more terrifying noise, an explosion bursting from amidships and emanating from across the entirety of its beam. The crewmen likened the sound to a gunshot, followed by a loud thump from below, as if the 6,700-ton freighter had just been picked up and dropped back into the sea. Upon inspection, Captain Carlson and his officers discovered a crack in the hull, just aft of the midship's house. It started just over a centimetre wide at the port side and then snaked clear across to the starboard side where it widened to nearly 8 centimetres. This must have been a dark omen, especially on one of the Merchant Marine's mass-produced wartime vessels. At this point, though, the ship was still on an even keel, and all the seawater had been pumped out of her. They still believed they'd be alright, after repairing the crack with canvas and cement and reducing speed, if the storm would just let up. But let up, it did not. At the same time that Flying Enterprise was battling the storm out at sea, things were hardly better on dry land. Gusts over 165 kilometres an hour, that's 102 miles per hour, were tearing through southwestern England, smashing small craft at their moorings, ripping away piers and flooding seaside streets. Dozens of ships foundered all along Europe's western seaboard. From Scandinavia across to the Iberian Peninsula, the entire continent was getting blown away. Making for land wouldn't necessarily be the Enterprise's salvation. It could even be her doom. Anchored offshore, if they failed, she'd be chewed up by the rocks. Carlson informed his bosses of the crack, but stopped short of sending an SOS seeking immediate assistance. He was still confident his ship could weather the storm out at sea. Yet, there were already rumblings below deck. The men were asking why a distress call hadn't been made, and why the ship wasn't making a beeline for the nearest port. The repairs seemed to be holding up, and the Enterprise was making headway. Carlson kept the bow pointed toward New York, angled so that the storm's severest blows could be blunted by her less damaged port side. But then, on December 28th, the unthinkable happened. A monster wave, thought to be about 20 metres tall, almost 100 feet, loomed over the freighter. When the wall of water rammed into her starboard flank, it stoved in the wheelhouse windows, shredded one of the 2 lifeboats, and ragdolled everybody on board. The sound of glass exploding and metal rending ripped throughout the ship. The impact knocked out electrical power, cloaking the cabins and passageways in darkness. By the time passengers and crew got to their feet, they found that reality had shifted. Their world was now tilted at a 25-degree angle, and it would never be right again. Carlson tried to swing the ship around to starboard, but the rudder wouldn't respond. He ordered full speed ahead, but a tinny voice rattled up the voice pipe. The plant had been kicked out, and Flying Enterprise was dead in the water. It was at this moment that Carlson sent out an urgent mayday. Encountering severe hurricane, he said. Situation grave. Have 30-degree list and just drifting. The reported position was 530 kilometres southwest of Ireland's Cape Clear Island, an Atlantic graveyard where the ocean runs roughest and deepest. As night fell, the situation got worse. Water was rushing into the number 3 cargo hold, and as the cargo began to shift, the angle of the list only got more dramatic. Carlson ordered all of the Enterprise's 48 crew and 10 passengers to abandon ship. Due to the angle of her tilting decks, though, the freighter couldn't actually lower its own lifeboats. One of them had already been smashed to pieces by the waves, but the other one swung loose and uselessly. Instead, they'd have to wait until other ships arrived and then leap into the churning froth to be plucked out of the waters by their rescuers. A US Navy vessel, the troopship General A.W. Greely, was the first to acknowledge Carlson's distress call. Then, the Norwegian SS Westfall Larsen said she'd reach Flying Enterprise by morning. 2 more Norwegian vessels also said they were proceeding in their general direction. 2 British ships, the MV Sherburne and the SS Warhawk, also offered to help. Carlson replied to their requests and queries, saying that the ship's limp had steepened from 25 to 30 to 45 degrees, but now at least half a dozen ships were converging on Enterprise from all directions. The British and the Norwegians were the first on scene, arriving in the pre-dawn darkness. Carlson told the ships to keep their distance. He had lost all power, and he didn't want to mount a rescue operation at night when all of the ship's lights were out, and survivors, bobbing like corks, could easily be lost in the abyss. Carlson asked the flotilla assembling around him to stand by until daylight, and as morning broke, the wind eased and a few nervous slivers of sunlight peeked out through the gloom. Passengers were asked to fetch warm clothes from their cabins and muster in the starboard corridor, where they were issued with life jackets. Seasick, scared and shivering, they were eager to get off their limping vessel. But that was easier said than done. Remember, there were no lifeboats. Carlson assured them that help was coming, but they might need to swim for it. Crew members had rigged ropes and ladders to help passengers climb up the sloping and swaying decks to where the captain stood, waiting for them on the boat deck. The tanker, Westfall Larsen, spewed oil into the rescue area to try and calm the waves. When Carlson spotted their first potential rescuers, a lifeboat from the freighter Southland, he began to summon the passengers one by one. Women and children first, must have felt more like a burden than a blessing in this case. But staying true to the Birkenhead drill, Carlson ordered Elsa Mueller to make the first jump. Wearing only a nightdress under her coat, the 55-year-old mother climbed hand over fist along the ship's rail to where the captain stood under the useless lifeboat. He handed her the end of a rope that disappeared into the cauldron below. He assured her that there was a lifeboat at the other end, hidden behind a curtain of spray and a restless mountain range of rolling swell. As they crested a wave, Carlson caught a glimpse of the waiting lifeboat and tapped Elsa's shoulder, the signal to jump into greater danger, seeking safety. When she surfaced, Frau Mueller wiped the oil from her eyes and lost the rope. As her husband and 2 children looked on, she found it again and pulled. The Southland men drew her in, but then began to return to their own vessel. As they battled through the waves, Mueller, desperate for help, kept repeating one of the few English words that came to mind: children, children. Agonizingly, though, she would have to wait. Her rescuer, Southland's second mate, feared being swept in under the Enterprise's overhanging hull, and his captain agreed. Sherburne was next up, but her boat's crew couldn't get close enough to Enterprise, and they beat a retreat as well, capsizing on their way back to the mothership. Even the rescuers now needed rescuing. It was up to the Warhawk, but her lifeboat never even neared the wallowing freighter, having capsized almost as soon as it touched the water. Thankfully, both the Sherburne and the Warhawk men were all saved by their own ships. Southland's crew bravely decided to make another go of it. The little lifeboat was so tossed about by the sea that half the time they couldn't even see the flying Enterprise, since they lay so deep in the waves' troughs. But thankfully they managed to haul Elsa out of the roiling ocean. Now, it was Leanne, her daughter, who was waiting to jump from the boat deck. Without a line for the 19-year-old to cling to, Carlson made a slight change to the rescue plans. From now on, a crew member would accompany each passenger, jumping hand in hand into the water and awaiting rescue. As visibility waxed and waned, 2 people would be easier to spot than 1. This method worked for Leanne, her 11-year-old brother Lothar, and several other passengers. Altogether, Southland's lifeboat saved 11 passengers and crew, including all of the women and children on board. The Navy ship, the Greeley, arrived and launched her first motorboat at 9:45 a.m, managing to heave 7 men from the sea. But as they were heading away from the Enterprise, the lifeboat's engine failed. The officer ordered the oars manned, but they could make no headway. Instead, they made for the Southland, which lay downwind, and the survivors were taken on board. The lifeboat, though, was bashed heavily against the Southland's hull, and it had to be winched aboard with a cargo crane. Greeley then launched a second boat, but as they neared the Enterprise, they saw 4 figures leap into the water, and then immediately get thrown back aboard by the smashing waves. They were eventually washed astern, where the lifeboat picked them up. One hadn't made it. 54-year-old Nikolai Bunyakovsky was the only fatality in the operations. Greeley's officer, realizing that it was safer to have survivors jump from the stern, instructed them to move aft before urging them to jump. On their second trip, the lifeboat picked up at least 16 people still aboard the Flying Enterprise. The Navy ship's radio man reported a full number of survivors, then asked, "What about the captain? When is he leaving the ship?" Carlson signaled back, "I'm the captain, and I'm not leaving." And so began the most exceptional part of the Flying Enterprise saga, Captain Carlson's 12-day-long epic last stand at the helm of his limping freighter. His determination to stay with his ship as long as it floated was an incredible gesture, and it was one that would eventually inspire interest and admiration from across the globe. But to him, it was much more than that. It was a decision based on purely pragmatic concerns. He wanted to maintain command of Flying Enterprise at least until a tugboat arrived to take her under tow. It wasn't a doomed or futile effort to Carlson either. He sincerely believed that his ship actually stood a good chance of making it back into harbour, as long as the tug arrived soon and did its job well. And one was about to make it to the Flying Enterprise well ahead of her own ETA, the Dutch tug Ocean. But unfortunately for Carlson, though, Ocean was diverted at the last minute to rescue her sister ship, which had collided with a cargo vessel it was towing to safety off Brittany. The French tug Abai 25 motored out of Calais to look for the Enterprise, but turned back when she saw the full fury of the Atlantic. When his Branson line brought Carlson up to speed, he agreed that the Abai 25 just wasn't powerful enough. Enter Turmoil. Homeported to Falmouth on the Cornish coast, the plucky British tug was the most powerful tugboat in the world, at least according to her owners. She was already towing a shell tanker caught in the storm. Flying Enterprise wasn't yet a wreck, but it must have felt like one, with the vast, empty corridors tilted at impossible angles and swilling with icy water. Everything had to be done by torchlight. Carlson scavenged around for parts of the ship that were still accessible and above water, but he found little in unspoiled supplies. The thumping of waves, the clanging of metal, and the howling of the wind through the shattered windows formed a kind of ghoulish symphony. On December 30, a Navy observation aircraft took off from southwest England to search for the floating hulk. When they found her, the Navy pilot swooped in low and snapped a photograph, a striking image of a single, solitary speck of a man atop a drifting, dreary wreck. Some enterprising soul passed it on to the press, and it electrified Fleet Street. It was a story too good to be true, an old salt's one-on-one fight to the death with the ocean itself. What Carlson couldn't have known was how he'd bumbled into yet another storm, this one a media kind. When survivors stepped down the gangway at Rotterdam and Liverpool, they were met by reporters. The Flying Enterprise story was capturing the world's attention. It was first-page news, not just the day of the rescue, but virtually every day thereafter. Carlson's coverage was getting the 1950s equivalent of live tweeting or the 24-hour news network. Every new development deserved a headline. When there wasn't anything new to report, journalists ferreted out family members, salvage experts, or meteorologists for their analysis and projections. The world was on the edge of their seat. Could he pull it off? London's newspapers admiringly nicknamed him Captain Stay Put. At last, on January 3rd, the Turmoil pulled out of Falmouth Harbour in pursuit of its latest casualty. Carlson was determined to stay on Flying Enterprise at least until the tug arrived to begin towing the ship. While a spokesman for the Branson line said that Carlson's gallant stand was motivated by, quote, traditions of the sea, it can't be denied there was a very practical consideration behind it. His staying behind prevented the very likely chance that the ship might be seized by salvors as a derelict. When a crew abandons their ship, it becomes fair game for salvage firms who become entitled to a portion of the value of the ship and her crew. Admiralty law tends to be kind to salvors, and with good reason. There should be incentives to save ships and sailors in distress. Some salvage crews knew which danger areas were most likely to result in a wreck, and they patiently waited for their chance to rush out and secure everything that they could. In this case, Turmoil and her captain, Dan Parker, weren't just opportunistic scavengers. They'd been engaged by the Branson line to bring in Flying Enterprise, meaning that they had already agreed on the terms of the deal. What those terms actually were is as much a mystery now as it was then. But word had it that it was a harsh, high-stakes, no cure, no pay arrangement. If Turmoil's crew didn't get the Flying Enterprise to shore, they wouldn't see a cent. This question, too, was the topic of spirited conjecture. A Times article was headlined, "Salvage experts become popular," noting how the previously obscure industry was suddenly the topic of dinner-time conversation worldwide. On January 3rd, back at sea, the USS John W. Weeks, a destroyer, had arrived on scene. They managed to zipline a care package over to Carlson, and then, close to midnight, the Turmoil arrived as well. The tug and the Navy destroyer blared their sirens to alert Carlson. After one near miss trying to attach a tow cable in the dead of night, they decided to try again at first light. Conditions at sea were still incredibly difficult, and tethering a line to the rolling, yawing Flying Enterprise presented even more challenges. There was only one man on board, and thanks to the state of the ship, he had to hold onto something at all times, leaving only one hand spare. The standard method of shooting a cable was also out of the question, since the freighter was transporting huge sacks of highly flammable naphthalene, a volatile organic compound that could ignite the ship like a giant bomb if a rocket landed nearby. Instead, the tug would have to get up close and toss him a line by hand. As ever, the press corps offered breathless coverage. The New York Times devoted half a page to Carlson's lone battle against the sea, detailing 3 unsuccessful attempts to get the tow rope over to him, as well as disclosing tantalizing details like what food was sent over by the Navy destroyer. Incidentally, it was sandwiches, coffee, and some candy, which I'm sure was appreciated. Radio listeners got to hear the captain himself recounting his epic. The rescue ship Golden Eagle had made a 25-minute recording of Carlson's voice when he spoke to them over the ham radio. The next day, Friday, January 5th, the wind and the swell finally had died down. Despite multiple attempts, the line just couldn't be attached. Carlson nearly lost a limb to the backlash of a rampant metal cable. Turmoil's captain, Dan Parker, and his first mate, Kenneth Dancy, agreed that Carlson needed help. 27-year-old Dancy won this difficult job due to his sturdy build. Newspapers reported an attribute belied by his listed hobbies, which included knitting and classical music. The question of just how exactly to get him over to the ship was resolved when both vessels' sterns were pushed up against one another by a swell. Dancy quickly leapt across, grabbing onto Enterprise's taffrail and jumped from one vessel to the other. Well, less a jump and more of a step, really, as Dancy would later say. In that moment, the Flying Enterprise's complement effectively doubled, but so too did their chances of successfully attaching the tugboat's hawser. But more than ever, it was a race against time. The holds were taking on more water all the time. Already half buried by the ocean, the ship's list was getting more and more pronounced, and its bow was also digging deeper into the icy white waves. Luckily, Dancy seemed to have brought good weather with him. The next morning, the wind was down, and they were harried by only sporadic fog and a light drizzle. It was the calmest the water had been since Christmas Day. The 8th time was the charm. With help from his new surprise first mate, Carlson managed to thread the line through his ship's fair leads. The 2 men stood back and waved. The Turmoil growled into forward gear, the long steel cable playing out before them, and finally, Flying Enterprise was no longer adrift. Progress, however, was painfully slow. Turmoil was towing the Enterprise at a sluggish 3 knots, barely walking pace. But still, things were looking up. W.L. Thompson, captain of the destroyer John W. Weeks, estimated that Flying Enterprise had a 75% chance of making it. When the destroyer pulled into Plymouth Sound to refuel, Commander Thompson stood on the torpedo deck to take questions from the press, but all they wanted to know about was Carlson. That night, USS Willard Keith, another destroyer that relieved the Weeks, reported that Enterprise was 190 miles from Falmouth and its captain was in fine spirits. Carlson's parents had flown across the North Sea from Denmark for a hero's welcome that awaited their son in the port. Mobbed by reporters at London Airport, they said they were certain Kurt would succeed. In a recorded message on Sunday night, Captain Carlson's father said, "We are all with you in our thoughts, Kurt. Good luck. We know you will get the ship in safely now." Everybody was rooting for him. The jubilant mood on shore was reflected at sea. Carlson and Dancy had Sunday dinner delivered by line from the Keith. Steak, hot coffee, fruit and cookies, as well as cigarettes. The men found clean, dry clothes and turned in for a well-deserved sleep. All hands patient, rested and hopeful for continued favourable weather, the US Navy Greyhound reported after speaking with Carlson over the radio. The destroyer's captain, Commander Leslie O'Brien, added one final prophetic word of caution. He warned that the weather might take a turn for the worse. As dawn broke on Tuesday, January the 8th, Flying Enterprise passed the 2/3 mark in its 480-kilometre tow to Falmouth Harbour. The ship's list went from 65 to 85 degrees when a passing wave kicked it in the gut, just 5 degrees short of lying flat on her side. But for now, the weather was still looking good. The two vessels were still expected to make landfall by the afternoon of the next day. Airplanes circled overhead, while merchant ships transiting the English Channel slowed to crane their necks at Captain Stay Put and his tilting Flying Enterprise. Carlson's convoy had become something of a floating tourist attraction. Back in London, the US Navy's Eastern Atlantic headquarters, housed in a red brick building at Grosvenor Square near the US Embassy, continued coordinating control of the rescue operation. The commanding officer, Rear Admiral Walter F. Boone, praised Carlson's courage and his modesty, but he cautioned that he and Dancy had no more than a 50-50 chance of survival if the vessel capsized. The two-room public relations office in Navy HQ remained open at all hours to satisfy the British public's great interest in Carlson's fate. It issued daily bulletins from Commander O'Brien that acted as press briefings. Such was the interest in the story. The triumphant atmosphere was pleasant while it lasted, but come the afternoon of the 8th, it was washed away by yet another man-eating Atlantic storm. Parker and Carlson agreed to sit it out, and the foul weather passed after dark, but the hours she spent wallowing in the water meant she lost the momentum that had been keeping her afloat. When they got moving again, she rode even lower in the water and pitched harder with each passing swell. After a brief respite, the weather worsened once again. On the morning of January 9th, they awoke to find that the tow line had snapped. Attempts to fix it saw Carlson hurled across the deck by a 12-metre wave and nearly dragged under the water. By morning, the wind was eking back up to gale force. The Flying Enterprise was nearly on her beam ends. Even Carlson admitted to Dancy and said, "She won't last." Britain's RAF dispatched a helicopter to pluck the two men from the sinking ship, but the merciless wind forced it back. On Flying Enterprise, the ship seemed to be crumpling under Carlson and Dancy's feet. Explosions thundered below as the pressure building up inside the ship was blowing the watertight doors and the hatches that had long been battened down. The two men stood barefoot on the starboard rail, the highest point still above the water. That was the point that they had originally planned to jump from, but as the ship began to settle on her side, they decided the drop was too dangerous. Instead, they began inching along the now horizontal smokestack, half submerged, letting seawater surge into the ship's bowels. Flying Enterprise only had minutes left. Carlson and Dancy stood on the lip of the funnel as if it were a diving board. Picking their moment, they jumped into a receding wave. Carlson a split second after Dancy, ensuring that he was still the last man to leave his ship. The wave carried them clear of the rigging and the debris, but they were powerless to swim over to the Turmoil. The tug jockeyed around until she had the two men on her starboard bow, then lowered a rope ladder and tossed out some lifelines. Dancy clambered aboard first, but Carlson was so exhausted from his 12-day final stand that he needed to be lifted up by the lifeline he clung to. He still had enough strength, though, to stand up on the deck and say to the crew, "You've done a good job, boys." And then, to Dancy alone, he said, "I wish I had 10 mates just like you." Then, in true British fashion, the two were led below for a restorative cup of tea. Flying Enterprise gurgled down to the lower depths of the ocean at 4:10 p.m, just 40 minutes after Carlson and Dancy had jumped. It was a sad end for the ship. After 12 days of battling the elements, she was less than 80 kilometres. That's 49 miles from shore. But at least she went out with a bang. As she slipped beneath the waves, flares that had rolled off the deck somewhere ignited. The ships surrounding her sounded funeral blasts on their sirens. An ocean away, at the Isbranson Line's head office in Manhattan, a ship's bell rang out for their fallen freighter. Today, the Flying Enterprise is just one of the thousands of shipwrecks littering the bottom of the English Channel. She lies on a bed of sand and shingle under a ghostly blanket of abandoned trawlers' nets. She rests as she sank, still on her port side, some 72 kilometres out of Falmouth Harbour in Cornwall. Carlson ultimately failed to save his ship, but that didn't seem to matter to anyone but him. He still received a hero's welcome once he got to shore. The bells rang out, whistles still blew for him in Falmouth Harbour, the banquets, the speeches, the award ceremonies, it all went ahead as planned. Carlson felt all along that he didn't deserve the honours. "I feel I've not accomplished anything," he insisted to reporters. "It would have been a different story if I'd brought the Flying Enterprise into port. As it is, I just tried to do my duty." Yet it was precisely that devotion to duty that endeared him to so many. But Carlson was not without his naysayers. At the Coast Guard inquiry that convened just a few days after the sinking, 3 unlicensed crew members contradicted their officer's testimony, laying blame squarely on the captain. One of these men opined that the ship's hull had cracked thanks to the misstowage of its cargo. This was the age before containers, when goods were still handled manually, stored in warehouses, moved to wharves and then lowered by cranes or carried by hand into the hold and packed away by dock workers. The heaviest items were still loaded amidships and along the ship's centerline. This was crucial for the ship's balance and trim, allowing the bulky cargo to act as ballast, preventing excessive pitching or rolling in rough seas. But overloading the ends could also result in hogging, where the hull is bent downwards, straining the vessel to a potentially disastrous degree. Captains ultimately bore responsibility for ensuring that the cargo was loaded correctly. On Flying Enterprise, the heaviest cargo should have gone into Hold 3, just ahead of the engine room, where the ship was built the sturdiest to accommodate its 4,000 horsepower engine. But the pig iron was mainly in Holds 2 and 4, while a consignment of mail from US servicemen stationed in Germany went into number 3. This could have catastrophic consequences, making the ship more susceptible to capsizing, cracking, or even cleaving the hull clean in half, like other ships that had been mass-produced for the US Maritime Commission already had done. Another of the critical crewmen asked why Captain Carlson had immediately alerted his bosses to the ship's plight, but he had waited over 24 hours to issue a distress call. The third man demanded to know why Carlson hadn't turned back to the nearest harbour as soon as the crack had developed. At the time, that would have been Brest, on the Brittany coast, France's second largest military port. Well, another one of Carlson's haters had an answer. According to Red Fleet, the official publication of the Soviet Navy, it was all a nefarious American plot. Flying Enterprise wasn't carrying iron, cars, or typewriters, the magazine hypothesized, but weapons of mass destruction, specifically parts for a V-2 flying bomb and other forbidden armaments that had been manufactured in West Germany. It was just a few years out from the end of the Second World War, and the idea of Germany already rearming would not have sat well with Washington's European allies. Or so the Soviets said. The Soviets weren't the only ones raising suspicions about Flying Enterprise, though. Other observers found it suspicious that 2 US Navy destroyers came to the ship's rescue, postulating that she must have been transporting some special cargo like gold bars or zirconium, which was used to clad nuclear fuel rods. A confidentiality clause in the Salvage license, swearing them to secrecy about what they recovered from the seabed, pushed the rumour mill into overdrive. Of course, this is all the stuff of unsubstantiated conspiracy theories, but Carlson did have answers for the other more credible broadsides aimed at him. He told the inquiry that the cracks opened up in the decks by the lashing of the gales. They had, quote, nothing to do with the ship's sinking. It was crippling a 60-foot sea that heaved the freighter over, broke her rudder, and possibly shifted, he said, some of the cargo of pig iron ingots, pushing her further onto her side. The ship just never recovered from the list, Carlson said, and the subsequent storms that continued to batter the vessel forced her over until finally she capsized. After the cracks had appeared, Carlson said his first concern was to ride out the storm, which pushed him towards the Cornish coast. He considered making for a French port or running down to the Azores, but the towering waves and howling wind were so bad that all he could do was keep steerage way. As for the 24 hours that elapsed between his informing his employers of the situation and sending out that distress call, he said that he was awaiting orders from New York. The inquiry, which was convened to determine whether there was any negligence among the crew of the Flying Enterprise, and if their licenses needed to be suspended, found that there was none. Carlson would soon be at sea again. While the inquiry played out in the newspapers, covered as obsessively as a celebrity trial, Carlson's fans wouldn't let this rain on their parade. That's just not a figure of speech either, they really were planning parades for him. In New York, Carlson was to march up Broadway at the head of a 2,000-man column that included hundreds of cadets from the Merchant Marine Academy and contingents from the Navy, Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, Air Force, and police and fire departments, all with their own regimental bands. 700 more police were assigned for crowd control. At City Hall, a stand was erected to resemble the bow of the Flying Enterprise, replete with a metal smokestack flying signal flags that read, "Well done." Throughout the whole state of New York, January 16th was declared Captain Henrik Kurt Carlson Day. This red carpet reception was the biggest party New York had thrown since welcoming home Allied Supreme Commander Douglas MacArthur in 1951. Back in Carlson's hometown in New Jersey, his family was forced to move to a secret safe house to escape the relentless fanfare and press coverage. The mayor put aside nearly $20,000 in today's money for his own ticker tape parade, which he declared would be the greatest turnout in the town's history. Before Carlson could even make it back to America, though, he was already getting hounded by his adoring British fans. The captain was surrounded by admirers from the moment he stepped off the train in London. From the Danish club, where thousands of people pushed through police lines, he made his way to Lloyd's of London to receive their silver medal for gallantry. The beating heart of world maritime news and insurance came to a standstill for the ceremony. Captain Carlson continued working for American export Isbranson Lines for another 24 years, taking command of the Flying Enterprise II, creatively named, just a few months after his ordeal. After retiring in 1976, he operated a small launch for the Raritan Yacht Club in Perth Amboy, near his modest hometown of Woodbridge, New Jersey, staying close to the roar of the sea but far from the din of the crowd. So, why on earth was the world so enraptured with Carlson's saga? Well, consider the times. It was 7 years since the end of the Second World War, that apocalyptic struggle against an unambiguous evil. Decades of more war lay ahead, but the Cold War was a different beast. That was an age of secrets, spies and subterfuge, double agents and defectors. Maybe the public was sick of learning about the nuclear bomb. Maybe they just wanted some good old-fashioned heroics. In Carlson's battle against the very sea itself, there could be no doubt who was the good guy. No blurred lines between courage and cruelty. Unlike others of his generation, Carlson wasn't a war hero. He was a hero without bloodied hands. He'd saved everyone and killed no one. He was a simple hero for an increasingly complicated and morally ambiguous age. What Kurt Carlson really represented was something of a Rorschach test. 1952 was an election year in the US, and some saw his tale as a kind of political allegory. A letter to the New York Times asked, what if legislators, what if men holding elective power over their fellows, what if candidates showed in their conduct the quality of courage that Carlson and Dancy showed? A man who will risk his life at sea would probably risk his money, his reputation, or his career if he thought his duty called on him to do so. Let us look for men who would, if necessary, battle for a doomed cause if that cause itself were good, and not leave their ship as long as a mast remained on which to fly the flag. Others saw the Flying Enterprise story as an antidote to post-war moral malaise. We have, all of us, been troubled, another letter to the Times read, days upon end, by doubts of values. We have often seemed to live in a world of little meanness and monstrous depravities. It's good for us, therefore, to get the clean, sweet salt air of heroism blowing once more in our faces. If we're happy and grateful that Captain Carlson has done his job supremely, it must be partly because we're reassured that dignity, courage, and individual worth are still with us. We take comfort in knowing that the age of loyalty is not dead. Today, Kurt Carlson is far from a household name, but for those who know, there are still occasions to remember him fondly. Like, for example, when the Costa Concordia struck a rock off the Italian coast in 2012, or when the MV Seawall sank in Korean waters 2 years later, taking hundreds of people down with it. These were instances when captains abandoned their ships, their passengers and even their own crews off the bat to ensure that they reached safety on land before anyone else. These stories shocked and appalled us today, as they would have done back in 1952. And when tragedies like this happen, it's hard not to imagine why, for a brief moment in the 1950s, the whole world fell for Captain Stay Put.